Excellent. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank and congratulate the member for Mid Derbyshire and for Bromsgrove for bringing forward this critical piece of legislation. I'd just like to start in terms of my brief remarks just by talking about just recognising the importance of the institution of marriage. And I think all of us across the House, those who are married, those who aren't married, those who have civil partnerships, I think would all recognise that this is a critical, fundamental part of our society. It's so important for our communities. It's important to keep families together for raising children. I'm married myself. I think it's without doubt one of the best things I ever did in my life. Far greater than becoming a Member of Parliament. I'm just amazed I managed to convince my lovely wife to marry me. Which I think is more of an achievement than being elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament. But it's I thought you were going to give way there for a second, Mr. Speaker. But it's important that the institution of marriage is not corrupted, and it's protected, and we have strong legislation, and we have strong cultural provisions as well to make sure that the institution of marriage has that sanctity and importance in our society. Now, I'd like to focus a bit on what I see as the legal contractual elements of marriage. I haven't just done my pitch in terms of marriage and religious marriage. I want to just talk a bit more in terms of the contractual elements of a marriage. And I think it's really important to recognise that it is a serious decision, a serious contract that two people are entering into with incredible long-term consequences around finances, around rules with regards to next of kin, in terms of legal marriages, in terms of parental responsibility of children, which are only by default applied to men if there's a marriage at the time of the birth of the child. And as we know, unfortunately, when marriages don't work or civil partnerships don't work, unwinding them is very deliberately and importantly, there is a high bar to do that. So this is a contract between two people on steroids. And so it's important that the beginning of it, entering into a marriage or civil partnership, has robust measures in place to make sure people really know what they are doing. They really enter this willingly. They understand what the consequences are. And I remember what I had to go through in terms of my marriage, in terms of meeting with a priest, going through marriage courses, which were fascinating things amongst themselves, speaking to the registrar, where I was tested in terms of how well I knew my wife, and various questions around. So there's a whole procedure in terms of making sure people enter into this with open eyes and understand the gravity and the importance of this institution. Now, I've always thought that to allow 16, 17-year-olds to enter into marriage with parental consent is very odd, really, because it's such a personal thing. With such consequences, to have consent by proxy from your parents seems bizarre in itself. Now, I'm sure lots of children probably have competence when you look at it in terms of Gillick competence, in terms of understanding, certainly the ones over the age of 16, I'm sure quite a few have Gillick competence as it's assessed in terms of entering into a marriage, because in a sense, it's actually quite a simple decision. The gravity of it is very high, but in effect, it's very simple. In our society, in our culture, we all learn about marriage, we all know about it, we know what the consequences are. But it's the gravity of the decision that's problematic. Now, in medicine, we have parental consent by proxy. Parents consent on behalf of their children for medical procedures all the time. When they get to 16 and 17, parents can still consent on behalf of their children. But in these circumstances, there is a doctor or a practitioner involved who is recommending the treatment. Yeah? There's a third party, someone who is essentially an officer of the state, which doctors and nurses are in these sort of contexts, who is recommending this going forwards on a very deeply for a medical intervention, which is very different than a very deeply personal contract that one's entering into in terms of medicine. But even medicine recognises that there are some decisions which are so big, parental consent is insufficient. An example of that being ECT, giving electroconvulsive therapy for children under the Mental Health Act. There's an acknowledgement that you cannot or should not rely on parental consent alone, and you need other legal procedures. And I would submit, of course.
Thank my honourable friend Giveaway. Would he agree that this bill, which I congratulate my honourable friend for, is actually bringing legislation into the modern age? So I'm a big believer that it takes a village to raise a child, but actually what we're doing here is, as a society, saying that this isn't something that children should be doing at all, and we're actually giving young people, as they grow, the autonomy to make that decision for themselves without the need for parental control.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I entirely agree. I think this piece of legislation essentially brings historic marriage, views of marriage and marriage legislation into the 21st century, brings it in line, I think, with other areas of our law in terms of consent and individual autonomy. If you look at the Mental Capacity Act, one of the principles of the Mental Capacity Act is essentially to delay a decision if it doesn't need to be done there and then until somebody regains capacity in the context of someone lacking capacity. And I would argue that this provision, what we're debating today, is in line with those principles of the Mental Capacity Act, which is, there is not an urgent need, I would submit, for a 16 or 17-year-old to enter into a contract of marriage or civil partnership. I think that can wait till they're 18, so that we can be confident that this really important and big decision, one that will affect the rest of their lives, whatever happens, will affect the rest of their lives, is one that they enter into with full competence, but also willingly, with full sight of all the consequences and the benefits of entering into marriage. And that's, I know we're talking about child abuse and we're talking about, people are vulnerable, but it's also making sure people make the right decision in terms of who they want to marry. And not to put too fine a point in it, I think people fancy the night when they're 16 often are different than when they're 17, often are different than when they're 18, often are different than when they're in their mid-20s. So I think there's also a degree of maturity, but in terms of growing up as a person, which is part of this as well. So I think this is a fantastic bill. It doesn't surprise me at all, the cross-party support across the House. All I can say in my finishing remarks is I wish we'd been able to do this previously, and I just commend the member for Mid Derbyshire for bringing this forward.
Now come to Shadow Minister Andy Slaughter.